Buenos días, Quito. Agradezco a Ricardo Dueñas y a Mauricio Murillo, quienes lideran el grupo Ekos, por esta invitación para participar en la Cumbre de Sostenibilidad. Ha visitado varias veces Quito y el país por las negaciones, pero también las vacaciones. La riqueza de su biodiversidad y la amabilidad de la gente es siempre increíble. Disculpa que no puede ser aquí con vosotros. I certainly love the ambition of the Cumbre de Sostenibilidad. And Ecuador as a country, I have a lot of respect for. In fact, Conservation International named you the most biodiverse nation on Earth. The country with the most plant and animal species per square kilometer anywhere in the planet. Certainly my visits to the Galapagos and the Andean cloud forests, amongst others, have made a lasting impression. In fact, not long ago, I was at Mashpi Lodge there with an incredible experience. I know, despite the challenges, that you are a force for change. Net Positive, which I will talk later, is equally about building this force for change, this broader movement. In all of this, I'm convinced about two things. First, that the issues we face right now as humanity are so big that frankly no one can solve it alone. This requires cooperative leadership, not competitive leadership, especially on the issues when it gets to the future of humanity. And second, that business increasingly, if they like it or not, need to be in the driver's seat to speed up the move to a more sustainable and equitable future. It's difficult for governments right now. It's difficult for the multilateral institutions to play the role they were designed to play. There is a clear void at a global level, especially around the bigger issues that permeate borders. This is the time for responsible business to fill that void. And yes, it requires a movement to drive change. And this is exactly what Net Positive is trying to do. Drive a different paradigm of what good looks like, as more of the same simply won't work anymore. We find ourselves in a crucial moment for humanity. Only 12% of our sustainable development goals are actually on track. We know the challenges. Undoubtedly, the road ahead is bumpy and not easy, but we also know that we're running out of time, actually faster than any of us thought. Climate change is frankly the biggest challenge. At the World Economic Forum earlier this year in Davos, worryingly, I believe that climate change somewhat fell off the agenda. The discussions were about mis and disinformation, geopolitical tension, as you can imagine, and generative AI. As important as these things may be, the own WEF risk report actually shows that things like extreme weather events, critical changes to the world's Earth system, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, as well as natural resource shortages, are some of the biggest threats facing companies over the next decade. And yes, it's here already. So it shows that we need to constantly have to push against what I would call climate complacency. 2023 saw again record heat and weather events across the world. Many argue that we already are at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And yes, unfortunately, it's accelerating. We're closer than ever to negative tipping points in many areas. And costs are in the hundreds of billions, not only in monetary terms, but regrettably also increasingly in human lives that are unnecessarily lost. Unfortunately, with the existing commitments that we have today, even if we implement them all, it still projects to a 2.5 to 2.9 degree temperature increase by the end of this century. Not surprisingly, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, said it very well when he said the era of global boiling has arrived. And the price we pay, frankly, is high. Economically, the rate of growth has probably halved from 5% to 2.5%, mainly driven not only by pressure on globalization, but certainly also pressure on the planetary boundaries. Over-reliance on unproven carbon removal technologies, expansion continuously of fossil fuel operations, and delays or backtracking in efforts to decarbonize are all putting us actually way off track. We need to set more ambitious targets and we need to move faster with more tangible implementation, not less. We need to work harder than we thought to save our world. An exponential problem cannot be solved by linear thinking. And inequality, by the way, the other side of the coin, is also rising. For the first time in generations, the number of people living in extreme poverty has actually risen. Last year alone, 333 million people faced acute food insecurity. That's a 67% increase of pre-COVID levels. And we've seen the pushback to all of this in the polls, making political actions very difficult, also in your country. This year, over half of the world's population, 64 countries, actually go to the ballot boxes. While 70% of people see climate change as a major threat, 30% believe that in their countries, moving to a greener environment is involving too much of a sacrifice, and as a result, right now, is resisted. Especially in the emerging economies, the issues are even bigger because they're virtually bankrupt. The high levels of debt in 39 countries in the developing markets, where, by the way, most of the new emissions are coming from, are outright in a debt crisis, with 11 other countries being in debt distress. We can all see, frankly, the threats to business as usual, and they're no longer theoretical. They're here today, and they're costing us. We're now in a situation, I believe, where actually the cost of inaction is now starting to exceed the cost of action. In fact, Deloitte puts numbers on there. If we stay on the current trajectory, what we're doing today on global warming, the cost by 2070 will be about $178 trillion to the global economy. Were we to rise to the challenge and stay around 1.5 degrees, we could turn that into an economic benefit of $43 trillion. The cost of inaction is higher than the cost of action. And that makes it such an exciting business opportunity for the ones who understand this. We've discovered during COVID that we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. So now we have a choice between either facing the catastrophic results of breaking all the planetary boundaries and getting into these negative feedback loops, or we have a choice to rise to our senses and make the dramatic changes that are needed to get us towards this more sustainable, towards this more equitable future. Tinkering around the edges simply don't do anymore. To help accelerate that transition, we actually wrote the book Net Positive, How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take. A little bit counterintuitive perhaps, but we need to shift the underlying paradigm with which we do business to adopt what we call a net positive or regenerative mindset. We wrote this book to help companies and those leading them to that trajectory. It is the second best-selling business book last year for Harvard. It's number 3 on the Thinkers 50 list and translated in over 15 languages. And in the book, we ask 2 very simple questions. The first one is, how can we profit from solving the world's problems, not creating them? And the second one is very simply, is the world better off because my company is in it, yes or no? The premise of the book is simple. Last year, World Overshoot Day was August the 2nd. That means every day after that, we're stealing from future generations. World Overshoot Day, by the way, is the day when we use more resources than the world can replenish. You would agree with me that we're living well beyond the planetary boundaries. Less bad simply isn't good enough anymore. We need to move to restorative, reparative, regenerative thinking. And that in essence is net positive. Many companies issue sustainability reports. I would argue nearly all of them do. Many CEOs believe that moving to more sustainable, equitable business models is good for their long-term survival and profitability of their businesses. Yet we're not moving. And the ones that are moving are writing in their sustainability reports things like less plastics in the oceans, less carbon emissions in the atmosphere, less deforestation in my value chain. The essence of the book is that less bad simply isn't good enough anymore. By continuing to reduce our negative externalities, but with the enormous economic growth that we still have behind our business models, still producing these negative economic externalities, make climate change go up, make poverty go up. So we need to break that paradigm and move what I call from CSR, corporate social responsibility, to RSC, to become truly responsible social corporations or net positive corporations. And that's hard work. But we all know that it seems impossible until it's done. Yet more and more companies are actually doing that, making commitments to go to regenerative agriculture, restoring soil health and biodiversity, getting to carbon positive or climate positive business models. Take Microsoft, taking carbon out of the air going back to the 70s when the company started. Some companies are increasingly addressing the inequalities, fighting for living wages, or getting rid of human rights violations in our value chains. Now, to implement net positive requires an alignment not only of your personal values, but also of the values you have as a company, the mission and what you stand for, as well as the organizational structures. At Unilever, it meant working at 3 areas. First and foremost, getting your own house in order. That invites you to the table. Align not only your management team, but all your colleagues as well. Then secondly, partnering across your industry, your own value chain, but also horizontally across the industry. Working these deeper partnerships to get to the bigger issues. And then last but not least, working on the broader systems transformations with civil society, with governments, to ensure that we collectively have that courage to move on an accelerated basis forward. What I call working on the forests, not working in the forests. We all know that change is hard, but we also know that entrenched systems are actually not so entrenched. We often get the false sense that the status quo is the status quo is the status quo. Entrenched systems, especially of these globe-spanning companies, may appear impossible to dislodge. But consider that none of the 10 most valuable companies today were on that list in 1990. Consider that many actually didn't even exist in 1990. Changes can actually happen in a few decades' time. My advice is to start simple. Take a few simple areas that go straight to the bottom line or accelerate your top line. Work on waste prevention. Work on maximizing efficiencies and performance. Look at renewable inputs where you can. And look at using safe degradation of materials where you must. With largely rooted in sustainable environmental sustainability, if you look at these 4 simple areas, it actually also gets to the social well-being for your workers, the fence line communities where you are, or the uses of your products. These goals are not that easy to get started on and won't overcomplicate things. And my third message is, don't strive for perfection. Perfection is unattainable. Sustainability actually doesn't have a perfect state. The most important thing that you start on the journey and set the bar continuously higher to improve every day a little bit more. Unilever started its journey in 2008 when I came in from the outside, which was at the height of the financial crisis. The business had declined for over a decade and no shareholder value was created. It had become victim of their own short-term behavior, chasing the short-term financial targets without a clear value creation strategy for the longer term. So we went back to the roots of the company, creating a compelling purpose, making sustainable living commonplace, setting a vision to double our business, but decouple that fully from our environmental impacts, maximizing our overall social impacts. The result was 10 years of industry outperforming top and bottom line growth, a nearly 300% shareholder return, whilst, yes, moving to an increasingly sustainable model, setting the tone for the industry, being long-term, being multi-stakeholder, having purpose at its core, taking responsibility for our total impact in the world across our value chain. And yes, carefully balancing both business and environmental and social objectives. So the starting point here for everybody is what I would call unlocking the company's soul. It is clear that it starts at the top. You cannot have a sustainable or purposeful company if you are not sustainable or purposeful yourselves. Rumi, the poet from Iran of the 13th century, said it very well when he said that yesterday I was smart, I wanted to change the world. But today I'm wise, I'm changing myself. It starts with each and all of us. And that's why the first question we ask in the book is a very simple, do we care? Understanding the real issues out there and how they affect your business models is absolutely key. The second step is to develop a strong company's purpose. Willpower actually comes from cultivating net positive leadership principles, such as purpose, humility, and courage. Creating a compelling vision based on core values. Instilling these values in all you do. Now, a company can only head towards this net positive if its leaders are courageous enough to embark on this journey, and that comes from a strong sense of purpose. In Unilever's case, it was making sustainable living commonplace. The third step is actually to own the total impact of your operations. There is something in the world that says if you break it, you own it. So you own the problem. A leader's mindset is not to offload the problem to other players, but to take on the bigger challenges and to own these challenges as well as the solutions needed. It's moving from a handprint to a footprint to what I call a blueprint. It's not only anymore scope 1, 2, or scope 3. In the book, we're actually talking about scope 4, 5, and 6 on your broader impacts to create the ripples that are needed. Many companies still think they can outsource their value chains and also outsource their responsibilities. It simply doesn't work anymore. In Unilever, if you're in the food business, that means you have to work deforestation, smallholder farmer incomes, food waste, or issues of obesity, all of them being in your value chain. Then the next step, number 4, is to make it a cornerstone of your company strategy, embedded in all of what you do. In fact, sustainability has to become your strategy, not, as I see too often in too many companies, a side hobby. Take an honest appraisal where you are, measure your impacts across the value chain, and focus on the biggest areas that you can make a difference. In Unilever, we provided the space for people to do that, abolishing quarterly reporting, not setting guidance, creating the green funnels in our R&D programs, giving indeed people the space to think and, more importantly, behave long-term. Setting clear targets, in our case 50 of them, and making them public. By doing so, we built the needed trust and transparency, absolutely needed for the partnerships that I'll go and talk about next. For Unilever, we embodied all of this in the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, with 3 overarching targets: to double our business, to decouple it from environmental growth, to improve our overall social contributions, and 50 smaller but more important detailed targets of how we should do this: reducing our carbon emissions, our water footprint, restoring biodiversity, but also fighting for issues like human rights, job creation, diversity and inclusion across our value chain, and the list goes on. The next step is very simple: After you've made your own house in order, you really need to get to the bigger issues. And if you have a long-term model, that means by definition multi-stakeholder, you have to work with all of your partners. First in your own value chain, but then across your value chains. That's what we would call the 1 + 1 = 11, the multi-stakeholder models. Ultimately, it needs collective action from companies to drive systems change. In partnership, ultimately, not only in your industry or between the partners of your value chain, but more importantly, between civil society, governments, and others to drive the lasting changes. In Unilever, that meant working with the government of Indonesia and Malaysia to stop the issues of deforestation linked to palm oil. It meant working with the governments across the world, with the United Nations, to put in the right frameworks to protect human rights. It means working with governments to put the right tax systems or retirement systems in place. Indeed, going beyond the boundaries of your companies to move to these broader structural changes. And then last but not least, you have to embed it in your company culture. Culture is your glue, and that comes with consistent messaging, commitments, actions, and more importantly, behavior. In so many companies, there is simply too big a say-do gap that raises issues of trust or followership. So people will remember more what you do than what you say. So if you don't walk the talk, why would anybody take you seriously? And my final point would be to all of you, be consistent in what you do. That's what I call the elephants in the room. Many companies claim they're very purposeful, but 1/4 of the Fortune 500 company has not paid any tax since 2018 and continues to work very hard to not do so. Many companies are saying one thing publicly, but then using their trade associations to lobby actively for the opposite. Many companies still have corruption in their value chains and turn their heads or close their eyes, even when they're aware of it. Human rights issues that still exist. How many companies can you get actively involved to solve this issue? I think my message is clear. The language from the top, as well as the behavior from the top, is the most important thing. And once you start talking about purpose, multi-stakeholders, a longer-term vision for your business, I think slowly, bit by bit, it will also start to shift your cultures. In Unilever, that resulted very simply in a 290% shareholder return over 10 years, a 19% return on invested capital, despite nearly 60 acquisitions. And yes, 10 years of top and bottom line growth. It made us the preferred employer brand. Our corporate reputation went through the roof. And yes, engagement scores in the company were very, very, very strong, in the top of the top tercile. That alone would drive financial results. So implementing a net positive model isn't easy. It sets the bar very high, but it recognizes that change needs to happen, well beyond the scale of the industrial revolution and much faster than any technological revolution. The problem is that many of the things are dragging us down. Our day-to-day challenges, the political environment, perhaps the vested order pushing back. But fortunately, more and more CEOs are now starting to realize that there is no business on a dead planet. And we've certainly seen this change and shift in company attitudes and behaviors. But that's not enough. What helps, I think, is that the environment has changed. Expectations have changed. In fact, it is now expected of a chief executive officer of any company to not only deliver profits and happy shareholders, but also deliver more jobs, to also ensure that the way you earn your living, if I may call it that way, it doesn't make this a world that is worse off, but a world that is better off. Many of the employees that you hire will only want to work for companies that reduce not only their negative footprint, but start to move towards a more reparative, restorative mindset. The good thing is we're moving. We're in second gear. The car is moving forward. $1.8 trillion of green investments last year, outspending the investments in fossil fuel. tipping points on solar, on electric vehicles, on windmills, on battery technology, and the list goes on. And leading companies that are increasingly being rewarded see it not as a risk, but as an opportunity, not as a cost, but as an investment. Governments are rapidly putting new frameworks in place. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US, the Green Deal. Accounting standards are coming in with the Task Force of Financial Disclosure on climate-related risk, nature-related risk, the Sustainable Standard Board. Yes, governments are moving. The financial markets are moving. $70 trillion of assets under management have agreed to decarbonize their portfolios. Indeed, many companies are moving. We've doubled the number of companies making science-based target commitments on climate change in the last 12 months, for example. Consumers are increasingly putting their money where their mouth is and buying sustainable products if costs and quality are equal. And last but not least, I'd say the major force of change has come from your own employees. 30% of employees have deliberately quit organizations because they were not aligned with their values. And 60% are considering doing that. It is in your interest, if you want to have the best and brightest to work for you, to actually embark on this path. And there is increasing evidence, actually, that consistently applying the principles of net positive and actually working to actively solve these societal problems will also give you a financial benefit. Companies that spend more on R&D, work for the longer term, embrace the multiple stakeholders, have a 47% higher revenue growth and faster growing market cap, according to McKinsey. The companies that are leading on climate change, amongst all the companies that are moving, the ones that are more actively decarbonized, are seeing better financial results. Companies that are more diverse from board level onwards and embrace the diversity we find in society are actually getting better financial results. That wasn't obvious when I started in Unilever. There weren't any data. The proof on how it would drive financial results was not very well established. But I believe we moved past that point. I also think that what is true for business is true for countries. For countries to actively lead that transition will also help them. We just worked on Brazil with the upcoming COP30 on their ecological transition plan and saw a doubling of their economic growth behind making their country more sustainable and more equitable. You have many of the elements to success as well. You have the right climate there, amazing biodiversity, critical transition minerals. Of course, you need to continue to accelerate your economic growth to solve your issues of lack of inclusion, to pivot away from the fossil fuels you still depend too much on. But the alternatives are increasingly becoming visible, moving your countries as well as your companies from a CSR mindset to an RSC or regenerative mindset. But ultimately, it is about leadership. There is no organizational change and no organizational change of magnitude without individual change. We have the technology, we have the financial means, and we have the awareness, I believe, of what needs to be done. But often we're stuck in the impetus of getting action in the first place. This is much more a leadership transformation, in fact, as it is an organizational or systems transformation. Change is difficult, many skeptics and cynics along the way. And for that true north to get going, you do need a strong purpose. It does take courage. It takes leadership from the top. Still too many companies play not to lose versus playing to win. Still too many companies set low targets that are under their control, not wanting to enter in the discomfort zone. Still too many companies shy away from these broader partnerships that are needed. And just like COVID, I've seen a bifurcation in business models during COVID, where companies that were multi-stakeholder, longer-term purpose at the core were being more successful than the ones that were myopically focused on shareholder value. But we've seen the same bifurcation on leadership. Companies that had leaders operating with a higher level of humanity, humility, empathy, purpose, long-term focus and partnerships were more successful than the companies myopically focused on the quarters and the shareholders again. So we believe that net positive leaders have a few essential traits or characteristics that make them successful. A sense of duty, purpose, and service. They understand what they do. Mark Twain said 2 important moments in life: the moment you were born and the moment you found out why you were born. These companies understand why they are here. They're tapping into something bigger than themselves. Secondly, an important trait of a net positive leader is empathy. We talked about compassion, humanity, humility. Our first chapter asking the very simple question, do you care? Well, empathy comes from recognizing the humanity in others, seeing that they are no less in deserving a thriving life, peace, justice, education, clean water, clean air, health, and the list goes on, making it available to everybody. That should be our mission. The third trait is perhaps courage. I like the word courage. It comes from the Latin word cor, which is nothing different than to speak one's mind by telling all one's heart. Courage is a hard word. Everything about net positive leadership requires courage. Setting the targets, taking responsibility of your total impact, working with governments on these broader transformations. All things that need courage. Force is related to courage, is your ability to actually inspire others, often by walking the talk and showing the true moral leadership. As a leader, you're constantly in a position to demonstrate your values. It is key that your words and your actions match. Showing people that you are committed to the values you espouse works at all levels of the organization. I believe that it is not just about giving energy, but more importantly, by doing so, unlocking the energy in others. And fifth and final is a bias for action, a bias for transformative, collaborative cooperation and action. True transformational change requires that broader partnership we talked about. In fact, many people in this world would argue that ultimately this is not a climate change crisis or a food security or an inequality crisis. This is a crisis of greed, of apathy, of selfishness. I always say that leadership starts at the moment that you realize that by putting yourself to the service of others, you're ultimately better off yourselves as well. It indeed starts and ends with each of us individually taking responsibility. That's why in Net Positive, we ask the simple question, do you care? We need courageous leaders with a broader growth mindset, who look beyond the short term to the longer term, who take that responsibility for the total impact, who set the targets that science demands, who take care of all stakeholders, who are cooperative leaders versus competitive leaders, who embrace this broader transformational partnership, who make the tougher calls, what I call the harder rights versus the easier wrongs. And yes, who face the tougher issues like human rights, taxes, corruption, or CEO salaries. They are first and foremost good human beings. If we focus together on tackling these burning, wicked issues, I believe we still have a chance to leave a positive legacy. Every decision and every action we take today will impact tomorrow. And yes, it starts and ends with all of us. Wangari Maathai, who was a Nobel Prize winner from Kenya, said it very well when she said that in the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called upon to shift to a new level of consciousness, what she called to reach a higher moral ground. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you agree with me that that time is now. Good luck on your journey of purpose, of courage, but above all, of impact. Hope to see you soon on one of my future visits. Thanks for all you're doing.